All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, good people. My name is Ravyn Miller. I'm a Senior Marketing Director with Medtronic, and I will be the moderator for today's town hall, which is going to be focused on minority representation in clinical trials. We have an exciting program planned for you, which is sponsored by the National Urban League as well as the Divine Nine. I am a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And I am excited to share with you insights, perspectives, and contributions from my fellow D9 brothers and sisters. During today's panel, you'll hear not only the current state of ethnic minority enrollment in clinical trials, but also strategies and insights on how we can improve enrollment and experience of minorities as they enroll in clinical trials. So I hope you are ready for an engaging and enthusiastic conversation for the next couple of hours. And with that, we're going to watch a video before we hand it over to opening remarks from Marc Morial, CEO and President of the National Urban League, Dr. Gary Puckrein, of you all know, President and founder of the National Minority Equality Forum, as well as Congresswoman Ravyn Kelly. Thank you all so much.
All right, so
you ready?
On your mark.
I'm Marc Morial, and I'm president of the National Urban League, but I am also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. COVID is hurting Black America. The number of deaths are disproportionate. The number of cases are disproportionate. Our community needs a safe and effective vaccine. Without a safe and effective vaccine, many more people will die unnecessarily. Without a safe and effective vaccine, you and I, or our parents or grandparents or loved ones, can find themselves terribly sick and also face the severe consequences of this awful, dreaded pandemic. Reason and common sense suggests that for a vaccine to be effective on Black people need to be part of the clinical trials process. The clinical trials process is part of the development of all medicines in the United States. And this vaccine is critically important. So I say yes. I'm raising my hand to volunteer for the clinical trials, and I hope you'll do so also. Reason and common sense must be greater than fear and distrust. The deans of the Black medical schools, many African-American medical experts, are working hard to ensure that these clinical trial processes are safe for us, and that ultimately, that any vaccine developed is effective on all people, including Black and brown people and other people of color. Hey, thank you for listening to me today. I'm Marc Morial. I'm president of the National Urban League, and I'm a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity.
And next, we'll turn it over to opening remarks from Dr. Gary Puckerin.
Good afternoon and evening to everyone, and thank you, Ravyn, for that. Clinical trials are incredibly important for our community. Certainly, they're important for drug development and understanding both the safety and the efficacy of medications as they touch minority populations. And historically, the way the system has worked is that we were not in the clinical trials, and it was in the clinical setting where safety and efficacy got determined. And that was far too late, because sometimes we got adverse reactions and sometimes medications that did not work as well in our population. So it's extraordinarily important that we participate in clinical trials. And I know the history. We all can say Tuskegee backward and forward, but the point is that was in the past. Lots of things have changed since then. through the work of folks like Dorothy Height, who was part of the Belmont Commission, who looked at clinical trials. And so there were all kinds of safety precautions put in place that make clinical trials really safe for us to participate in because the learnings are really incredible. What's also not well appreciated about clinical trials is that clinical guidelines, those guidelines are written to help physicians understand how to treat patients with a particular disease. Those guidelines are written based on the clinical trials. So if you're not in the clinical trials, you're also not going to be well represented in the clinical guidelines. And again, what ends up happening, because we're not in the clinical guidelines, it's in the clinical setting when the physician goes to treat you that we find out whether that medication is safe and efficacious for you. But it goes even further because those clinical guidelines inform pay for performance. What we do in this country, we incentivize physicians and others to treat according to the guidelines. And so if we're not in the clinical trials, we're not in the guidelines, and physicians start to get paid for performing with therapies that may or may not be absolutely safe and efficacious for us. So clinical guidelines are sort of the foundation of our healthcare system. It is where the science gets established, and so it's critically important. Now, it's not unusual to find that populations have been excluded from clinical trials. In the early, up until the 1990s, for example, children were not tested in clinical trials. And Congress came up with the pediatric exclusivity provision, and it encouraged the treatment of encouraged clinical trials in children so that we would have labeling. Labeling is used by physicians to tell them how to use a medication. And because children are smaller and their metabolism is different, it was really important to have those tests done so we knew how to treat them. There was also the orphan drug. Here, we were not testing people with rare diseases. We were not developing medications for rare diseases. And Congress passed the Orphan Drug Act. And right now, there are probably about 790 drugs that have come out for rare diseases. About 58% of all of the drugs that were tested in 2018 are a consequence of the rare Orphan Drug Act. The National Minority Quality Forum would argue we need to start thinking about how we use that exclusivity provision to encourage diversity in clinical trials. It's a deeper conversation that we should have, but the point is there's a history in which we've used legislation to incentivize, to increase diversity in clinical trials because it is so very important. And as America becomes more diverse, becomes more important that we have diversity in our trials. So looking forward to this conversation tonight. It's an important one. It lays to the foundation of how we'll deal with disparities and all of the issues that are concerning us. So listen carefully. I think we've got a great panel here tonight, and I think there's a lot of great work ahead of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Puckerin. Always words of wisdom. I could listen to you for hours. Now I'm going to turn it over to the Honorable Ravyn Kelly. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Ravyn. Good evening, everybody. I'm Congresswoman Ravyn Kelly, and I represent the 2nd District of Illinois in Congress and serve as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Braintrust. Let me start by saying thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to join you and the NMQF tonight for this panel. As a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho, I know the importance historically Black sororities and fraternities and our membership play in the Black community, from volunteering in the community to registering people to vote to all the scholarships that we give out. We play a pivotal role in spreading awareness and giving back to our communities. As COVID-19 has shown us, Politics impacts our health in ways that we often overlook in daily life. But when the world is put on hold by a global pandemic and we see death rates among African Americans that are 4 and 5 times the white death rates. In fact, according to a study by the Brookings Institute, COVID-19 is the 3rd leading cause of death of African Americans, trailing behind only heart disease and cancer. Much of this can be attributed to the fact that large numbers of Black Americans live in states that have not expanded Medicaid. This is why we must remember we decide our health at the ballot box. Now our nation is undergoing a key step in the fight against COVID-19, vaccine trials. However, as was said, because of decades of disturbing mistreatment, there's a rightful mistrust of the medical research community by African Americans. As a result, we have very low participation rates in clinical trials, despite the outsized impact of disease on our communities. Additionally, we historically have low rates of uptake for vaccines, specifically for the flu, but also other vaccines more broadly. These factors show us how critical it is to have this conversation on working to address this ingrained mistrust now more than ever. Every year, I have the privilege to participate in and present during the NMQF annual summit. And although we are virtual this year, I'm glad to support the work of this organization that lifts up the voices and achievements of the best and the brightest minds on the front lines of minority healthcare. So many of the panelists here with us tonight are doing the hard work of research and enrollment, driving policy, and working on the front lines to keep our communities healthy and safe. As African Americans, we know why many of our family members and neighbors distrust the medical community. In Congress, we are still fighting to win Henrietta Lacks the recognition she and her family deserve for immeasurable contributions her cells have made to science and our health. But as Dr. Puckrein said, that is in the past, and we need to move forward. While our community rightfully has reason to be suspicious, things are changing, and we need them to help us keep us and our families healthy. More and more physicians are focused on medical ethics, and they are working to identify and address inherent biases in healthcare. Also, the medical and scientific workforces are diversifying. Still too slow for my taste, but progress is progress. Since those dark days, new procedures and processes designed to protect people and their families have been implemented. Yes, risk is an inherent part of our new and groundbreaking medical innovation, but now, as opposed to the past, it's informed risk, not gross experimentation. There are resources for patients to empower themselves and their families with information and knowledge to direct their own care. Plus, there are now programs to assist with medical care and resulting side effects associated with the research vaccine. You might be thinking, why should I volunteer to be a guinea pig or a lab rat? But to be frank, if we aren't part of the trials, we aren't part of the cures. I recently spoke to a reporter who found that less than 1% of participants in phase 1 trials for 2 promising vaccines were African American. Under NIH and FDA guidance, a vaccine needs at least 30,000 Americans to participate in phase 3 or the final phase to advance to market. While the agency encourages vaccine makers to recruit a study population with overrepresentation of minorities, there is no requirement to do so. We can't afford any blind spots with our vaccines, especially given COVID-19's disproportionate impact on our communities. Considering the huge amount of your federal tax dollars spent on these vaccines, they need to benefit all Americans. COVID might be top of mind, but it's only one disease that disproportionately claims the life of African Americans. HIV, maternal mortality, gun violence, heart disease claim more African Americans than they should. In fact, African Americans die at higher rates from 8 of the 10 top killers of Americans, including COVID, which is our most pressing battle. But there are so many other diseases and disorders that we need diverse clinical trial participation to defeat. But it's not just enrollment in clinical trials that will help us in overcoming these obstacles. We must also expand the number of African Americans working in the medical and biomedical research fields. If we have people who look like us, talking to us in our communities, who are from our communities, communicating the importance of our participation, we can start to build trust. In Congress, we have a bill called HEA. This legislation has strong provisions to increase participation in research by African Americans and provisions to recruit a new generation of Black healthcare and research leaders. I'm so encouraged to be able to contribute to and welcome our wonderful panel full of amazing Black professionals who all contribute to the health and well-being of our community in their chosen field. I hope in this conversation, we can encourage our brothers and sisters of the Divine Nine to learn more about Black participation in clinical trials and serve as ambassadors through their work to encourage more people in our community to enroll in clinical trials. And please remember, if we aren't part of the trials, we are not part of the cure. So thank you guys so much again. It's an honor to be with you, and have a great panel.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. I really appreciate it. All right, so with that, we are ready to get on to the panel. We are going to introduce everyone. So what I'm going to ask is that we go in our founding date order, where we'll introduce everyone. We'll have you share your name, what company you're with, what D9 organization, of course, you represent, and why you chose to give your time here today. So about 1 minute for everyone. And that means we are starting with Alpha Phi Alpha, which is Dr. Ron Bailey.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ron Bailey. I'm a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha. Thank you so much for inviting me into today's program. I'm currently the Assistant Dean for Clinical Education at UCLA Drew out here in Los Angeles. In my day job, I'm actually the Chief Medical Officer for the Kedron Hospital System. And I've been, so I run a 72-bed inpatient hospital system with both outpatient psychiatry and outpatient primary care. We have a HRSA grant for, we run an FQHC. I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much. We're now going to go over to 1908, Jacquelyn Wilson.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important panel. I work for Pfizer Incorporated, and I am a senior director and research clinician and working in our drug development in terms of phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 trials. And because I work in that area, I thought it was really good for me to be a part of this so you guys could see that there is someone that looks like you that work at Pfizer and work. And part of my responsibility is being a part of the design, the execution, and the interpretation of the studies, monitoring the studies in terms of their safety, along with our study physicians. I am a part of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority proudly. And the reason I'm here tonight is, again, because I want you to understand why I go to work every single day. And that is to make breakthroughs and better medicines, to be a part of that. For someone whose family members have had to take medications and have experienced bad side effects as a result of medications, I want to help educate people that it is important for us to participate. It's a decision you make on your own, but if you have more information, maybe it will help you make a better informed decision about clinical trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. All right, we're gonna go to the brothers who share my colors, the crimson and cream, right? So let's start with Marion Brooks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marion Brooks, a life member of Kappa Alpha Psi. Also Vice President and U.S. Country Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Novartis Pharmaceuticals. And I'm here today because I'm helping drive policy within our organization around increasing diversity in our clinical trials, as well as across the Pharma Trade Association for all biotech and pharmaceutical companies. I sit on one of the boards there as well. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I had a conversation last week with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee on this exact same topic. So really excited to hear from everyone and to share my perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Marion, appreciate it. It was so nice that we did it twice. So we have another member of Kappa who's here on the phone, Bryant Fields.
Hi, thank you. Bryant Fields, I'm a senior director in the Integrated Evidence Group at Metadata Solutions. I'm here today because I'm also a board member actually of the New York Urban League. So thank you, Marc, for opening it up in that regard. I'm here today, having worked in the industry for many years. I've been very close to the data. That's pretty much where most of my experience has been. And while in my day job per se, my role is to help commercialize our data asset, which is the largest clinical trial repository in the industry. Increasingly, what we're doing is generating thought leadership. So helping understand the differences in clinical trial participation and the racial, the differences among race that come along with that. And when I see that, you know, our ability to power those abstracts and those studies is sometimes limited by the numbers of actual Black patients in our repository, it certainly calls to action for me to be here today to help with the appeal to do what we can collectively to increase our representation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Really appreciate you. So now we're going to go over to my brothers, the men of Omega Psi Phi, and that is being represented tonight by Joe Briggs.
Good evening, everybody. Joe Briggs here. I am Public Policy Counsel at the NFL Players Association. At first blush, that may seem to be odd on this panel where we're talking about diversities in trials and clinical trials. But what you should know is that the NFL Players Association has pushed for one of the longest and largest clinical trials for athletes in the United States of America. And some of the data from that has not only far-reaching implications across not only our sport, but sports across the board. I was part of a team that helped put together that trial, a clinical trial, and not only the long-form studies that are coming out of the Harvard Medical School. In addition to that, we were one of the first major sports to come up with our COVID protocols to come back and perform sport this fall. And though we've seen some minor setbacks this week and a shuffling of our sport, some of the data that has been generated from our daily testing of our NFL athletes, most of whom, almost 80% of our league being African-American, have been very helpful to us understanding exactly how not only COVID affects African-American populations, but also with the large BMI of most of our members of the National Football League. There's also data there that also has far-reaching effects. We've been sharing this information with all of the populations that we've come in contact with, including governmental agencies. And as a part of that work, we've also started to understand how and what role we may play in helping advocate for other people using not only the technology that's available, but availing themselves to clinical trials because of the need for more diversity in their spaces. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and Rue.
Knew that was coming, and I'm here for all of it. With that, I'm excited to now introduce my sorority sister, Courtney Fitzhugh.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I'm also a Lasker clinical research scholar with the National Heart and Lung Blood Institute at NIH. And that means that I run clinical trials. I'm a physician scientist, and my research focuses on sickle cell disease. So I work with a group of patients who've had a genetic disorder their whole life and as adults are mistreated, frequently thought of as drug seekers, and we're working with them to enroll them on clinical trials. Our trials involve bone marrow transplant as a curative option for people with sickle cell disease. So I'm here because I wanted to share my expertise. There's 100,000 African Americans living in the United States with sickle cell disease and millions around the world. And we're able to actually recruit even from other countries. So I have a lot of experience enrolling people, underrepresented minorities onto clinical trials. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Courtney. Looking forward to hearing from you later today. Dr. John Ansley is representing the Blue family. So come through, friend.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm John Ansley, a otolaryngologist, ear, nose, and throat surgeon. My practice involves doing a lot of clinical research. And over the past 20 years, we've been involved in probably 75 to 90 studies focusing on a wide breadth of ear, nose, and throat medicine, but we also do allergy studies, even food studies. And so I'm excited to be here just to give some perspective from a frontline clinician in a private practice who actively tries to recruit minorities into my trials. And fortunately, given the demographics of my city, we've been very successful in that. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And then Zeta Phi Beta, you are up. Ifoma Ike, thank you.
Yes, hi, and thank you for saying my name correctly. My name is Ifoma Ike. I'm a proud member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Shout out to all of my sorors celebrating our centennial. And I'm trained as a social science researcher in behavior and also as a human and civil rights attorney. And as a professor in Africana studies as well as political science, I come to this space to give some of the background in many of the ways that some folks don't want to focus on, which is why the behavior and or the relationship between our communities and the medical world, how that impacts the way that clinical trials are messaged to our communities, but hopefully using this time to also think of strategies that are data informed, but people centered. I am the founder of a social impact firm called Pink Cornrows. And earlier this year, we were one of the first Black-led organizations to release a study called COVID While Black. And then we modified it and relaunched it in partnership with the National Black Justice Coalition to do COVID While Black and queer. And the reason why we did that was just to make sure that as we are talking about the African-American community, that we are not lumping all of us as if we are a monolith. There are very distinct ways that we need to communicate and engage with our communities based off of the many things that make us both great and also vulnerable. So happy to be a part of this conversation to talk about how we can align and put a movement that allows for people to not see medicine as a space that is trying to harm them, but a space that needs them to ensure that we actually stay healthy. So thank you.
Thank you, really appreciate that. And we are going now to the blue and gold. Tracey Brown, you are up.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I am a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho. Shout out to my soror, Kelly, and all my sorors out there. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the American Diabetes Association, which is the largest patient advocacy group representing all forms of diabetes. I myself have been thriving with type 2 diabetes now for 17 years. And this issue around clinical trials is so very important. When you think about diabetes in this country, 1 out of 2 people are living with diabetes or pre-diabetes, with a disproportionate number of those people being people of color and African Americans. People of color represent about 50% more likely to be living with diabetes than not. And African Americans dying at a rate of nearly 2.5 times that of whites. So this topic is so important when you think about the fact that 80 to 90% of the clinical trials are not diverse. And when you think about the medication, the supplies, the technology, the equipment, all of the things that are needed to help us thrive and to stop us from dying are dependent upon the very need to have us participating in these trials. So that is why I'm here, a very, very important topic. And again, I'm thankful and grateful to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Rouhan Cox. Excited to hear from you, friend, and tell us who you're representing.
Thank you very much, Ravyn. Hi, my name is Dr. Rouhan Cox. I'm a proud member of Iota Phi Theta Fraternity Incorporated, and I'm so happy to be here amongst great colleagues, great friends, great amazing professionals who share the same important characteristic of thriving and working in the medical space and to dispel disparities. My company, I kind of wear 2 hats at the current moment in time. I am an Industry Alliance Development Manager for Moffitt Cancer Center, the only National Cancer Institute designated center in the state of Florida. And I also am the Assistant Director of Business Development for the University of South Florida, working closely with the University of South Florida College of Medicine. And so I am an immunologist by trade and a research scientist, but my main focus on the day-to-day is to work with companies to establish partnerships to be able to advance and propel cancer forward, while also working with companies to advance technologies forward, specifically in the medical space, that would lead to better treatments and better options for patients. It's amazing to be here because I see myself, just like many of the other panelists, as a representation of and an advocate for our communities. Each and every time that I make a partnership, and each and every time that I partner with medical organizations, pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, startups, or large matrix organizations, I have the opportunity to build partnerships that take into account things like health disparities, that take into account how clinical trials are built, that take into account exactly how, when you work with an academic institution, how research can be handled. And I'm proud of that, and I'm proud to be able to contribute my thoughts on such a distinguished panel.
All right, thank you, Ron. So this is the chance where the audience gets a chance to participate. We're going to pull up a poll question here before we jump into the panel, just to kind of level set where we are with the conversation. And so if we want to go ahead and pull up the question here, feel free to start participating. In what year did Congress pass the National Institutes Health Revitalization Act, which required the agency to include more women and people of color in their research? If you would go ahead and put your answer in and then hit submit. Give you a second here to read the answers. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. And the answer to this is 1993. 1993. So the 24%, you are on it. And the reason why we wanted to pose this question was to let you all know we've been having this conversation about the need to diversify clinical trials for a very long time. And so this is where I want to jump in with the panel a little bit. And my first question is this: what is the current representation of ethnic minorities in clinical trials? So maybe let's start with you, Ron, so you can talk about it from your seat. And then Courtney, we'd love to hear from you on this as well. So Ron, we'll start with you. Ron Bailey.
I think I'm going to move to a different seat shortly. We do this for the hospital typically, quite as well today. But yeah, our numbers generally are well below 15, 20%. And also, I didn't think I mentioned earlier, in psychiatry, psychiatrists are typically in my basic training. And we've actually had lower numbers in addiction psychiatry, particularly, than we've even seen, I think, in many other areas of organized medicine, which has had remarkably adverse impact on us. First and foremost, I think Gary Puckrein said if we're not in the trials, we can extrapolate the data. But I've also thought that the other piece is that we're not in the trials, we actually don't encourage more young African-American and other biomedical researchers to participate, I think, in collecting information, in encouraging persons to actually join trials, and then actually thinking through, I think, the design of trials, which often may not include some of the particular kind of concerns that are unique, I think, for our patient population. So I think one of the huge challenges for us going forward is to actually educate and advocate for African Americans to be involved in every aspect of clinical trial process, from the initiation of the idea to development, to recruitment, to participation, and then even extrapolate on the data. Huge issues for us, I think, always in medicine, particularly in psychiatry.
Appreciate that. Courtney, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I work with patients who have sickle cell disease. And so by definition, the vast majority of my patients, or the people that we enroll in clinical trials, are African-American. And we started doing bone marrow transplants at the NIH in 2004. So initially, when we didn't have much experience, it was challenging to recruit these patients. And we started with the patients that were being followed at the NIH, the ones that knew us, that we had some kind of a relationship with. But more recently, the transplants have been so successful that, my mentor has been on 60 Minutes. He was interviewed on multiple TV stations. So now we actually have an overabundance of people trying to come to the NIH, since we do have this opportunity to offer a cure. On the outside, it is more challenging, especially when people are not enrolling patients onto trials that involve cure. And so they do have the biggest issue, even for us, when we're bringing people to the NIH, we still spend about 1 or 2 months trying to overcome that trust barrier. Again, because these patients are so mistreated, they're at home in so much pain before they even go to the emergency room because of the way that they're commonly treated. So we spend the first couple of months really trying to build that trust. And we also meet patients where they are. We go to advocacy groups and we ask them what kinds of things are important to them as far as being enrolled in clinical trials. So that's how we're able to, and even paying for transportation, which is a big limitation for a lot of our patients. So that's how we've been able to overcome and get people to enroll in our studies.
I appreciate that from both angles. I do want to go back to something that Ifoma mentioned earlier, even during her conversation in her opening remarks, which is there are some historical factors that we can't ignore. And so my question to you and to Rouhan is help us understand what factors may be driving low enrollment of ethnic minorities in these clinical trials, both from a patient perspective and then maybe even from an institutional perspective.
Yeah,
We'll start with you.
From like the community perspective. And I don't want to go as far back, to encapsulate how we got to the practice of all areas of medicine, including OBGYN, basic family care. All of them are rooted in really depressing and oppressive practices dating all the way back to enslavement. But there are some recent studies that I think could be helpful in how we look at the factors that drive low turnout for communities. The first study is a 1996 study that was in the Journal of the National Medical Association. And it identified 4 major barriers to participation. In that case, it was a stroke prevention trial. The first one was lack of awareness about the trials. We find that there typically is either an under messaging or poor messaging within communities of color, communities of ethnic backgrounds. And even if they are there, they're often not considerate of multiple languages, complicated language, or just the times at which they're being advertised and the modes by which they're advertised. The second factor that they found as a major barrier was economic factors. Now, pharmaceutical companies are getting better at providing trials and making sure that incidentals are also encompassed in how people can participate. But at not even just within the last decade or so, we have seen that individuals that have had to drive to a site or have had to use their own resources to participate tend to drop off, even if they signed up to be a part of the clinical trial. The third factor that this study found was communication issues, which is similar to the lack of awareness of the trials, that even when people were a part of the studies, keeping up with what the goings-ons of the studies was significantly different within our communities compared to, say, white counterparts who were also a part of the trial. And then, of course, finally, mistrust, which is still connected to even a later study than that, a 1998 study that also showed that individuals that were enrolled, they dropped off because they felt that they were being seen as guinea pigs. The reason why this is really important, and guinea pigs is a quote, that is not me categorizing it, that is how our communities address the way their either participation or their lack thereof is being treated. So it's not enough for us to say that past doesn't matter. The reality is you don't have trials without people, and we must do a better job understanding where people are entering into the conversation and ensuring that we're not insulting where they're at, but we're using that as a way to support industries, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or those that serve as credible messengers within the community, which we'll talk about later. How do we solve for this? But as of right now, there are 2 distinct groups. One is for those that do stay in trials, there's a little bit of research that shows that they stay in it because they already know that they have a high risk of being either impacted by the ailment that's being studied, or their family is connected to that ailment. But a significant number of us drop off because even when we participate, we kind of have a little bit of an irking feeling that maybe we're being used, and we drop off.
Yes, and I'll go ahead and add on to that, and that was great. I think that covered also some of the points that I was going to mention, amongst with the fear and the communication. I'll also add, in terms of the communication, medicine and science is a very jargon-filled atmosphere. So when you're communicating on a patient level to someone, and you're adding in all of these words that someone may not necessarily be able to relate to, that creates an environment where someone does not feel attached to that particular study. And so within that, there's a lot of patients who don't feel like they have a proper understanding of what they're being explained and why this is particularly important and why they may fit into that. Along with that is the publicity of how individuals were mistreated in the past. And so along with that publicity of how individuals were mistreated in the past, there's also a lack of publicity in terms of how important it may be. And so that abundance of information in terms of how things were done in the past versus the lack of information of how things could be, it could be helpful for someone to participate, then contributes to a culture where someone does not feel comfortable in terms of contributing. And then finally, I would like to say that a lot of minority communities rely heavily on the opinions of others close to them, whether it be a family member, a mentor, people of that sort. And so when you have that information that is being passed down that may not necessarily be of the best view of clinical trials, then that individual doesn't feel like they want to go more so the safer route or more of a watchful waiting route rather than one that may contribute to the field and add the diversity to the field. And a lot of that, and speaking on the institution, comes from the intentionality of the institution. There seems to be a lack of intentionality on a lot of institutions to make diversity something that is particularly important. And their feet are not being held to the fire for that intentionality to take place. You see with a lot of diseases such as cancer, where age, if you're a certain age, there has to be, things that are taking place, data that is recorded. And now you see more demographic data being required for certain rare disease trials and things of that nature. But intentionality is one of the big things. Do they have clinical trial coordinators that can be able to explain to the patient when they're consenting them, exactly what is going on and how this may be particularly effective? And then also, does the study coordinator or the investigator that's handling this trial at the institution, do they care really about the diversity, or do they care about meeting a patient accrual quota that would then necessitate their results? All of which contribute to the lack of biodiversity and why biodiversity may not be of the highest priority.
Excellent
I'll
answers.
jump in too if I can.
Yeah, please.
I wonder if there's ever been a study that actually looked at the race of the principal investigator in terms of addressing issues like trust, comfort level, jargon, and just familiarity.
Yep.
Again, as I spoke about earlier, I've done a bunch of clinical trials, and I do think it matters that my African-American patients view me as someone they can trust and not someone who's white who would do anything to them. To that end, we are very selective in the trials that we choose to participate in, just because we want them to feel that comfort, that we would not put them in a trial that we would not put my kid in or my family members in. And I think that's an important issue, that when the sort of stakeholders and others are looking at sites to choose and select for studies, need to look for investigators who look like the patients they hope to enroll.
Absolutely.
I saw a lot of head nods going on, so I think you maybe hit the amen corner with that answer, John, so I appreciate that. So I want to actually have you build on this point. I'm going to probably ask Jacquelyn to jump in here as well. Dr. Puckrein, in his opening remarks, started to kind of allude to what is some of the potential impact of having low to no ethnic minorities enrolled in clinical trials. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what you believe that is. So Jacquelyn, we'll start with you, and then John will come over to you.
Absolutely, thank you. Again, the decision to participate in a clinical trial is an individual's decision that should be made with your family, your friends, and with your loved ones. But what we found, and if you look in the data from 2008 to 2013, 21% of the drugs that were approved on the market the FDA noted later that there was a difference between the safety and the efficacy of these medications in African Americans and minorities. And why is this? And that is because of the demographics. That is because we all are different in some kind of way in terms of our genetics, in terms of our gender, in terms of our age, other disease states, comorbidities, other medications we're taking. Well, how we metabolize a drug, how we eliminate a drug, how that drug works in our system versus someone else's system. These are all important factors that have to be taken into consideration. And if they're not, we find that we have drugs that make it to the market that may not work as well in someone as they work in another minority group or in another population. For example, ACE inhibitors are widely used for the treatment of hypertension. ACE inhibitors, now we know, do not work as well in African Americans. However, there is a side effect known as angioedema, which is a swelling that can occur in the face and the mouth, and it can also occur in the throat. It's 5 times more likely to occur in African Americans. We didn't know this because there weren't enough African Americans that participated in the study, and we found out after patients in the clinical setting, as someone said. So we found out later. And this has led to many of emergency room visits when they do have problems with the, when it happens in their throat and their larynx is impacted with the angioedema. So this is one reason why we need to participate. There's also data that looks at in our breast cancer, tamoxifen. Because of the low numbers in the original study, these studies showed that African Americans did not do as well on tamoxifen. However, later sub-study analysis shows that African American and white women that are ER positive both do well with tamoxifen. So it's not just for others, and I know there's a lot of mistrust, and I know we have to continue these dialogues, and that's why I'm glad we're here today, so that we can help people understand it's not just for others, it's also for yourself, because you don't want a medicine to get to the market, you take it because you have diabetes, you have hypertension, and then you react to either it doesn't work as well for you or you experience a severe side effects. So we are committed to doing a better job. We know that we have a long way to go, but at Pfizer, we are committed to having these conversations, to doing a better job of trying to engage minority populations in our study so that we can make better drugs for everyone, not just for a certain population.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. John, you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I think that was very well said. And I think the take-home point is that we are different. In some ways, metabolically, we're different. And we find that in the way we metabolize the medicines, and I'll give a couple of examples as to Jacquelyn. If you take codeine, some African Americans are hypermetabolizers of codeine because of different enzymes. And the codeine gets turned into morphine, and you run the risk of having an overdose. And now codeine in pediatric patients now has a black box warning because of that. As Jacquelyn said, the hypertensive medicines are one that's known to react differently in African Americans versus whites, but also asthma medicines have the same issue in terms of how we handle the beta blockers and the asthma medicines. So it's real important that when you're studying these very common diseases like asthma, hypertension, pain medicine, that we have a wide breadth of different minorities in these groups so that we can be prepared to know how the Blacks or whites are going to metabolize them, what are the potential side effects, and how efficacious will it be such that we don't get medicines on the market that won't work in Blacks, but are yet getting repeatedly prescribed with no real clear explanation as to why it's not working.
I agree.
Well, there are similar cases in psychiatry, Ravyn.
Yeah, please go ahead and elaborate, Ron.
If I can just have very similar cases in psychiatry. I'm a psychiatrist and was really shocked to find out about a decade or so into my career that for so many African American patients who have been disproportionately labeled and actually mistreated for being medication non-compliant, we found out that the classic medications in psychiatry, the D2 blocking agents that treat, violent aggression and psychosis, very often are not metabolized via this cytochrome P450 2D6 system. So the pharmacogenetics are very different in African Americans. About a third of us can't really metabolize those meds, only about 68% of Caucasians. So we were being hostile toward Black patients all throughout the literature that Blacks are more non-compliant. When we finally figured out the data pointed out very clearly that it was really our meds that were not tolerable by African Americans, and the side effects were very often causing them not to take them. Very similar point to the coding example.
No, I appreciate you jumping in there.
And if I could just clarify quickly, when we talk about metabolize, because everybody on the line is not in the science field, we're talking about the way your stomach breaks down, your liver breaks down these drugs. When we talk about the cytochrome P450, these are enzymes in our livers. We all have them, but there are some genetic differences around the different cytochrome P450. But these are just what you just need to know, that there's enzymes in our livers, and most of our drugs go through the liver to be broken down. When we say metabolize, they're broken down and then they're eliminated through the kidneys. There's genetic variations between enzymes in the liver. Also, there are differences in the way we eliminate drugs through the kidneys. And so again, we have to make sure we understand the differences, and we would rather understand during the clinical trials than when they get on the market.
I appreciate that clarification. I want to keep us moving forward here and really talk about intersectionality, right? When you have race plus income, race plus rural living, race plus education level, how does intersectionality play into potentially the enrollment or the lack of enrollment in clinical trials? Joe, I'd love to hear from you on this question, as well as Tracey. So Tracey, we'll start with you, and then Joe, we'll go to you.
Yeah, Ravyn, thanks for the question. So, this point of intersectionality, it's a cumulative effect, right? So you just highlighted all of the combinations, and there are many more combinations that lead to what has already been discussed: the lack of awareness, the mistrust, the economic factors, the communications. All of that gets compounded when you actually start to think about intersectionality. And as I think about it, I try to, as both a patient myself, helicopter all the way up and think about what we're talking about when participating in clinical trials is very much a behavior. And when you start to think about behaviors, at the base of that behavior is trust. And like we can take the mistrust that exists with African Americans, and all of us on this line can probably give you the long lineage. But even if you take that out of the equation, there was a Pew Research study done recently that said 35% of people trust science, period. Black, white, whatever. That is not good. So then you have to think about, well, what are the guiding factors? And what we really see is people believe people who have common values and connection. And so, if you're talking about changing behavior, you have to talk about, am I connecting with the person? And when we start talking about connections, it's basic. Do you see me? Do you hear me? And do you understand me? And if we can't figure out how to get that right, we're not going to get the behavior change. We're not going to get past the mistrust. So there are some very basic things that we have to think about as it relates to getting more diversity in these clinical trials. I think there's three things we have to think about. How do we rethink where we engage, right? Community. Somebody said already that there's a real cultural trend called distributed trust. People trust their tribe. They trust their family, their friends, their neighbors. That's a real cultural trend. So we have to rethink where the research engages. We have to retool how this actually happens. There's another cultural trend around frictionless behavior. You have to make it simple and easy. And you have to make it snackable. I have to be able to digest this. So I think we have to retool how we actually make participating a bit more frictionless. And then the final thing I'd say is we have to replace this notion of involvement with real connection.
She said a mouthful. Joe, I know you're going to add something to it, though. Come through.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna try my best not to get in trouble, but the conversation earlier about the race and ethnicity of the principal investigators was just a scratch on the surface. There's just so many ways that, and to go and piggyback on what was just said about having an understanding of how to make this snackable and more frictionless for the people who are participating. We also have to make sure that the people who are designing the studies, who are the principal investigator, who are coordinating the people getting in. I need you to see me, but I also need to see me in you. And if everywhere that I go, everybody that I talk to, no one looks like me, that's never going to help me get over some of these humps that we've seen in some of these places, these clinical trials that happen in a vacuum that is filled with people who I do not trust because they're not from my community and they never look like me. That does not seem inviting to someone. So when we were designing and trying to come up with ways to create some of our player studies, initially that was the way that some of the other folks thought that they should design. The traditional way, we find our principal investigator who looks like a certain way and they have certain credentials and they would have coordinators that they've worked with in the past and they all have a history of working well together on these things. These players didn't care nothing about that. They wanted to find someone who looked like them that they can talk to that could be a validator of why I even needed to return the phone call to even get started down the pathway of even getting to become a part of the study. So unless you are going to also talk about how we increase the diversity on the other side of the table and make sure that that's also included in the way these things are marketed, the way these things are talked about, the way that we normalize how these things are also a part of our community, and make it that seamless, that frictionless. I love that word that my sister just used. Until we get to that point, we will continue to see the lowered numbers and the intersectionality will continue to be a lost opportunity for us to find ways to better treat our communities. So one of the things that I hope to bring to this conversation is some of the things that we did. We brought in and invited in people who look like us to also have not only business relationships with some of the hospitals that we were working with, but we also included some requirements on those places to make sure that they also included folks that looked like the people that they were studying as a part of the team that was working with them and onboarding them and making sure that they felt comfortable as they continued to move through the process. Unless we do more of that, unless we place more demands on the people who are actually coordinating these studies to do that, then I think that we're going to lose more opportunities to not only find cures, but find ways to help our people be better. And that too is a part of the mission of all of this thing.
Ravyn, can I just add something very quickly?
Yes, please do.
This is when I hear intersectionality, I'm like, where's the papyrus leaf? I got so much to say. One of the things that I like to say is that representation is important. There's a lot of studies around the behavior and communication and how we connect with each other just from seeing somebody that looks like us, right? I also want to urge us to ponder with what it means for representation representation is not enough, right? It is important, and we also need to recognize that while we are professionals and experts in our own experiences, and this, I'm definitely gonna put on my imaginary helmet on, we are not necessarily inherently professionals in equity. To be professionals in equity, we each as a professional have to work at it, right? When Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality, it was because specifically for Black women and Black women who were poor and Black women who were poor and undereducated, they were being recognized for either being Black in the court system or being woman, but they were not recognized as being Black and woman. And the reason why that is important is that we can be in spaces where communities continue to say, this is what I'm experiencing. And somebody who looks just like them will say, you are not experiencing that, or that is not enough for me to focus on. And I want to say that because some of our language in spaces where all of us have very, fancy commas and letters at the end of our name. But I'm a proud girl from Trenton, New Jersey. I'm a hood kid. Great things come from the hood. Shout out to Cardi B. Like, we have to remember that, and I say Cardi B intentionally because Cardi B is a translator. If we are not connecting with individuals that can translate the intentions of all the experts on this panel, who at times may communicate from a space of the expertise that they're in, but maybe not the expertise of where people are at, that we can really miss people, and that adds to a layer of distrust where people see people that look like them, but then they start to assume that they work for the man. So I just want to put that out there because it's really important for us to see the experiences that we have as not just beginning with when we went to school, but really from our experiences that we saw the painful experiences of our mothers, of our grandparents, for those of us that have immigrant connections, and use that as the driver of how we connect the facts that we know with the communities that do live intersectional realities. Because as Joe said, and as Tracey eloquently stated, if we make it that this is about, I want to save your life, and this is, don't you see what I'm doing? What we sometimes miss is that it gets translated as, oh, I'm not smart enough for you. I'm not smart enough to let you know what I'm experiencing, or what I'm experiencing is not good enough for you to understand and meet me halfway. So I think this is a critical opportunity for even within Black communities and communities of color, not just to say Black Lives Matter as an external affirmation, but internally, how do we make sure that all Black lives actually do matter? And a lot of that is communication and relational, not necessarily the science.
All right. All right, Joe, you sound like you want to say one quick thing. All right, so I'll let you jump in here. Go ahead, friend.
See, if she gets me in trouble. So that I would say and add one last thing to that, that making sure that as you're going through and finding those people that can encode and decode, that you also have someone that's writing down the dictionary, right? Because one set of encoding and decoding for one population may not translate well. The way my football players talk is not the same as my basketball players, and how they express pain and how they express the way that something is happening with their body is not something that someone on the other side of the table may be used to. So finding someone that can help understand and translate that language is very important. And also it's very important that we document that so that the next group of people coming along don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we go through this, because that also sets up another barrier to participating in clinical trials.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Just shows that we are not a monolith, right? That there's diversity even within diverse groups. So I appreciate that. I want to quickly get some thoughts from Marion and Ron again, where we've said a lot. We said a mouthful about some of the challenges here. So if you were to think about how you were going to prioritize the 3 top barriers to clinical trial enrollment with ethnic minorities, how would you prioritize those? And so Marion, we'll start with you and then we'll go over to Ron.
So I think everyone has said it. We have to build trust as the foundation, right? If people don't trust you, they're not going to engage. And even if they engage, they're not going to continue in the process for the clinical trial. So there are a couple of things that that have been said about trust. So I think first of all is the investigators, right? So how do we increase the diversity of the investigators, the people that are actually going to be administering the trial? And that's something that's critically important that we're focusing on here at Novartis, as well as with the Pharma Trade Association. There's so many great minds out there, people of color, that are not getting the opportunities because of what was said earlier. Oh, they've worked so well with this person in the past. How do we break that up, right? And give opportunities to people who have the credentials that are ready now that can engage and increase the diversity of our clinical trials. So that's on the front end. On the back end is recruiting. So when you are going to recruit someone for anything, they have to have someone on the other side of the table that they trust. And for me, it's low-hanging fruit. And it's one of the things that we're doing at Novartis now that I've been pushing since last year, but we're finally at the stage where we're going to be partnering with associations, healthcare associations for people of color. So if you are looking for patients that are African-Americans to be in a trial, why aren't we going to the American Medical Association? Why aren't we going to the Black Nurses? So they trust them. They know who the patients are. It's a simple fix on the recruitment part from my perspective, because they trust them. But we also have to make sure we have those associations at the front end as well. The design, the locations, all of those things, they need to have a voice there so they trust the process. And then when they trust the process, they can in turn have their patients trust the process. So trust is number one for me. As former head of, I know you can't tell everyone the same story the same way and expect for them to digest it. So you have to meet people where they are. And you can't just put a Black face or a Latinx face on the cover of something, or you can't just translate it into Chinese or to Spanish. You have to be intentional. You have to be invested in making sure that you've done the research, that you've brought the right people to the table to be able to create a message that is digestible for different populations around clinical trials. We've spoken about all the mistrust and all of the issues that we have, and they are real and they resonate. I've heard for generations about Tuskegee and all of those things, the OBGYN situation with the enslaved women and no anesthesia, all of those things. So it's a scary thing for someone who's been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years. So with that, how do we craft our messages more effectively to meet the population where they are? And then the third thing is around access and location. So picking the right location, picking the right medical facilities, the right hospitals, not having people to need to travel 50 miles to participate. It's not realistic. How are we using innovation in telemedicine? How do we use those types of things and really think outside of the box to ensure that all people have access and a seat at the table? And the other thing about access is around patient assistance programs. So one of the things we did, and Courtney, I heard you speaking about the sickle cell population. With our most recent trial for sickle cell, we created a patient assistance program where we reimbursed them for travel. For those who had to stay overnight, we created a situation where we could pay for hotel stays and things of that sort. So I think there has to be a broader commitment to true access. And when you talk about intersectionality and you're looking at the economic part, the gender part, you're a working mother, right? And single mother working, how do you participate in a clinical trial and take care of your family? We have to do more to support, because it matters that they are in the clinical trials so we get the best product for all patients, as someone said, not just some patients.
Excellent. Thank you, Marion. Ron, anything you'd like to add? Ron Bailey?
Absolutely. I think that the comments of Marion are timely. Clearly, these programs are essential so we can communicate fairly well, I think, across a full spectrum of groups. We've had for 26 years now an entity in the National Medical Association entitled Project Impact, to do exactly what he mentioned, to really link private practice, African-American physicians. We have 40,000 in our organizations across the country. Very often we might not be specifically researchers who have large African-American patient populations. Most importantly, as I think Marion Brooks points out very correctly, they have the trust and the therapeutic alliance with the patients, where the patients like to believe in them. I'll give you an example. I was a chairman of psychiatry at Wake Forest for 5 years, 14 to 19, before I moved out here. And each year, in order to get more Blacks in North Carolina in cancer research, there'd be a big event, actually had it twice a year, where the African physicians would come, meet the researchers. Unfortunately, we only had one African-American oncological researcher there, and really work together to enhance, I think, a bi-directional communication so they could funnel patients who are African-American into cancer oncology research trials there at Wake Forest. So I think these are the kind of projects that we could actually work together on and foster or manifest, I think, a process where more African-Americans could actually be in trials who wouldn't normally get a letter or communication from a doctor at the Wake Forests of the world and participate.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And these are the type of innovative things that I believe in partnership with you all is really going to move the needle. But there is something that is very immediate and urgent, and this is COVID, right? We started talking about this in the opening remarks, and we know that while it has been a global pandemic for every country across the world, that it has wreaked havoc on Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, particularly here in the US. And so would love to hear, Jacquelyn, from you and from Bryant, what are some of the early learnings that we have around ethnic minorities who have enrolled in the trial, and what are some things that we could potentially take moving forward? So Bryant, we'll start with you, and then Jacquelyn will go over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think it's still a little too early to tell in terms of learnings in terms of outcomes from a race perspective. However, what's abundantly clear is that our numbers are traditionally are low as tradition has dictated. I think we're seeing about consistently about 20% enrollment in these populations in trials. I'll let Jacquelyn speak for speak for Pfizer, but at least from what I've seen quoted recently in Moderna, they're at about 20%. New England Journal of Medicine just reported out on ACT-1 trial where, again, they were reporting out at about 20%. And Dr. Fauci is calling for numbers, in some cases, at least double to 3 times that, given the disproportionality of the impact in our communities. But I think, if anything, if you want to say, I don't think that there's really a true blessing here, but something that was just mentioned on the last question is that I think that COVID is certainly going to, like everything, it's going to change the way we run trials. It's going to change the way we interact with our communities. Virtualization of clinical trials is something that's been talked about for years. And now, we're seeing, my mother is using Zoom, is using telemedicine. All the barriers that we, in some cases, our community has put up for the patient are being challenged and broken down because we were put in a situation whereby we have no other means but to reach out to our communities in different ways. Working with Dr. Jenna Andrews and Dr. Kevin Holcomb out of Cornell on looking at the ways that healthcare utilization has been disproportionately impacted in our communities, and the early information is bearing out that is the case, particularly I think in oncology. So I think it's a little too early to tell, but the early signs are clear that, one, we're still seeing a continuation of what we already know, is that we are low in our participation. But on the other side, we see there's an opportunity here for us to change the way we are conducting clinical trials so that we can reach our communities in different ways, as others have said, we can sort of meet them where they are and talk in the language that they're accustomed to communicating with us.
All right, Jacquelyn.
Yes, just to echo what Brian and Marion said, is that we have to rethink how we approach the trials. And so we did that, because this global pandemic, it does not discriminate. Everyone is being impacted. Probably everyone on this call knows someone directly, either in their family or a friend, that has been impacted by COVID-19. That said, there's still reluctance of the African-American community, as well as the other Latinx and Indian population, Native Americans, to participate. But what we did, the approach, and as Brian mentioned, the outcome learnings will not come to the end until the study's completed. But where we can focus in is more on recruitment. And what we did try to do, as Marion had talked about, and the industry gets it, we did reach out to a lot of our grassroots and medical and legislative community. We were on several calls going over our protocol, going over our materials. And so we learned that we have to get that voice. We have reached out to the National Medical Association, the National Black Nurses, 100 Black men, and we were on calls with them, and they would say, hey, wait a minute, we think you should do this. And we actually held up one day to kind of incorporate some of that feedback. We're starting now, but we know that this kind of partnership and this kind of communication needs to continue to go on. However, one of the things we also know is transparency is key. And so what we've been doing is that we have posted on our website, and every Monday you can go on our website and look at our numbers. And so we're almost 65% done with recruiting in the study. We have about 48% globally in terms of minority representation, and that's across minority populations. And then in the US, it's about 28%. But if you dig down deeper in terms of the African-American community, it's probably about 9%. Are we where we need to be? No, because we know that there's going to be that reluctance, but we are working at it. We are trying, and we have our clinical trial diversity center. And I am spending a lot more time working with our clinical trial diversity center, learning from them and working with them. And it's a two-way street. We have a multicultural center of excellence, and where we have an advisory board where we include all of these different voices so that we can try to get it right in the community.
Yeah, one other thing, if I can add one other thing, you just reminded me of something. I just want to put it into the context of us being gathered here today representing the D9. You know, I serve as the health and wellness chairman of my chapter. We have a captive audience. You know, all of us have a captive audience in our chapters, in our organizations. Congressman Kelly mentioned that we are disproportionately impacted in 8 of the top 10 comorbidities, mortalities at the top of in her introduction. I know exactly the slide that she's referring to, and I presented at my chapter meeting, at my first chapter meeting as part of my committee report every year. And when we got hit with this pandemic and saw how it ravaged our communities, and then you have to make the linkage to the underlying diseases, where again, you know, you go back to that chart, that's the source. And I think it's important that as much as we're talking about, you know, clinical trials and treatments, prevention ultimately will win over treatment any day. So I think that it's just important for us to say that, you know, we can't put this all on the patient, whether it's the patient enrolling in the trial or the patient being the perfect patient for us to meet the eligibility and inclusion criteria. We still have to do the work of ensuring that our communities understand that wellness and health is always best placed in their hands and empowered if they take a perspective of prevention. Because as we can see, you know, the other side of treatment is not always guaranteed as well when we start to think about the sentiment that the public has already voiced over whether or not they're actually going to take or trust the vaccines.
Fantastic. All right, so we are getting in the home stretch of our conversation. And with that, I'm gonna do a little bit of a costume change. All right, boom. These are the new glasses. Across my glasses is this gold bar. What is the new gold standard that we're gonna set as we move into clinical trial enrollment? Okay, so one of the things I wanna start off this conversation with is myth busters. How do we start to bust some of the myths that we have around clinical trial enrollment with ethnic minorities? And so, Tracey, I'm gonna start you off with this conversation, and Rouhan, I would love to get your perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. First, I love the gold glasses. Second, there are a couple of things that I think we need to challenge the assumptions on. And one is this notion that if we just make clinical trials more widely available, that in and of itself is not enough, as we have heard tonight. So that's one. We really have to figure this trust thing out and figure it out fast. Two, I do want to challenge this notion. I'm not a doctor, so all the doctors in the house can help me with that. As a person living with diabetes, you know, I am often not able to participate in clinical trials because I live with a chronic disease. And then when you think about living with a chronic disease, 98% of the adults, you know, with type 2 have at least one or more chronic conditions or comorbidities that they're living with. And so we get dropped out of all of that. And so then you add on top of that, the disproportionate number of people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, living with diabetes, the pool size comes down. So my challenge is, if we have another, a chronic condition and or another comorbidity that goes along with that, how can we evolve the clinical trial space so that more of us can actually participate? That's number two. And number three, piggybacking on what Joe talked about, you know, the investigators and having people who look like you. Yes, for sure. And then I want to add on there that we need to make sure that we start for all providers so that we can reach maximum. All providers need to have bias, implicit bias, some kind of training, because the bias is inherent and is real. So how can we actually start to provide some training for all you know, providers so that we can increase training. That's providers, doctors, researchers, all of the above.
Definitely all great points that Tracey illustrated, and just adding on to that, that also the glass change was amazing. Simple but effective. And I think that Tracey highlights such a great point. At Moffitt, you know, one of the things that I'm currently working on is structuring studies with our population science group around multimorbidities. And that's exactly what Tracey illustrated, you know, understanding those other factors that patients have to go through, that let's say you have diabetes, it's not just you're getting dropped from certain studies, but you're getting the runaround in terms of handling your specific situation with diabetes. And if you add cancer on top of that, you don't know who to go to and who's handling which, you know, who's on first and who's on second for each disease. So do our providers, and I'm speaking on this purely from an institutional perspective, because I think we've hit a lot about the perspectives of what are some of the myths that ail our communities in us getting to this ultimate goal. But do our providers understand what are the multitude of different things that the patients have to go through? They do not. You know, 80 to 90% of clinical trials being primarily and predominantly white, our communities and minority communities don't have the same things that they have to deal with. And it's not just about getting people on clinical trials, but how do you sustain them on the clinical trial when you're on it? Because that's something else that's not talked about as well, in the terms of adherence to that particular drug or adherence to that particular regimen. And that's something that we're not as much talking about in terms of, you got them recruited, but now how do you get them to stay there? I think there's a big myth going around that a lot of minorities are not willing to participate. And minorities, several studies have found through several prominent institutions, such as Yale being one of them, that minorities are very willing to participate. But I think that the stigma follows them, and it's something that's said before. Ron and Brian said this as well: as are you marketing? Or Marion, I'm sorry, Marion and Brian said this. Are you marketing appropriately to these communities? Not just diversifying or advancing your marketing, but making sure that you're targeted. Sometimes I cringe when I see marketing efforts, even at my own institution, where the folks on the marketing flyer or video or what have you are all of one particular diaspora or a demographic, and that's just not going to get it done. People want to be relatable. People want something to be able to relate to them. People want something to be able to understand them. And then also, in the same vein, is I am doing enough. And if your conclusion is that, the myth that I am doing enough as a provider or as an institution, if you are not being intentional, which is one of the key words that several of us have tried to drive home, if you are not being intentional about your diversity efforts in terms of stakeholders on either side, receiving the treatment and providing the treatment or planning for the treatment, then there is that myth there that we have to debunk, that we are doing enough, which we as institutions and organizations can always be doing more.
Then Jacquelyn, I think you had a very quick comment that you wanted to add. You're good? All right, okay, no worries. So I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I was here May 25th when the video that went around the world with George Floyd was seen. I've been out in the protest. I have been on the front lines, and I have felt the palpable change in the air. And I pray that that's not just here in Minneapolis, but that this is global. I almost choke up even thinking about it right now. But I want to hear from Joe and Courtney. With this context that we're currently in, what is different? What is now sustainable that may not have been even pre-COVID or pre-May 25th? Joe, we'll start with you this time, and then Courtney will go to you.
What is most sustainable is the way that people are paying attention. Well, first, because everybody's at home and most of the people are still working from home or either unemployed or furloughed. So now people have more time to research and look into things that they previously had no time to do because they were rushing from one place to the other. So now we have the opportunity to do some of those educational things that have just been talked about by coming up with a more common frame of reference and also using different marketing tools to try to get people interested, not only in what is happening around them right now. Everyone sees COVID-19. Everyone knows that they're talking about vaccines, but no one's really connecting the dots between how we get from where we are to where we need to be in order for us to move on to the next level of how we can be back to a sense of normalcy. So the question becomes, how do we find those translators? I think what was said earlier about Cardi B being a translator in some of these spaces, bringing more people into the tent to help understand some things that previously had not been talked about, is something that perhaps more principal investigators, more people that work on clinical trials, and more people in these spaces can take to heart. Find some people who can speak this language and spend some time not only educating them, but figuring out from them so that they can educate you on how to reach the people that they talk to every day. They're on TikTok, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, and they're telling people, you know, I ain't trusting whatever vaccine come out first. And they don't really have a reason to say, like, they've heard the rumors and they've heard some of the stories and they've talked to their grandparents, and maybe they heard something one time about something that happened a long time ago in a history class, but now they have that general sense of distrust and it's not really helping. So how can you find the validators that are also at home with these people in the relationship building? How are you going to do the work? And I think that if we are willing to do the work, if we are willing to break down some of these barriers that have existed for quite some time, then we would probably have better outcomes. But I also think one of the more important things about, and I keep referencing Cardi B, but one of the more important things about that is the points about intersectionality that were brought up earlier. If you get the message to Black women, if you get the message to Black women, if you get the message to Black women, it has a way of reaching many other cultures quite faster than it does with any other population. That's just the way that it is. So if we're trying to make this thing sustainable, finding the people that are validators in those spaces that we know work could be very helpful to us.
Excellent point. Courtney, love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I would say that definitely not just Minneapolis or people have been severely impacted by this, is people all over the country, all over the world. And because of that, you know, people of all colors, and now programs are being developed with the goal of increasing and promoting diversity. So the NIH has a program called SEAL, which is specific for COVID-19, where there's two purposes. The first is to increase awareness and education in order to overcome these barriers with trust. But another important one is that they're promoting and facilitating enrollment of people of diverse backgrounds, African Americans, onto these clinical trials that are looking at vaccine and treatment development. So I'm really excited about these programs that are going to develop to make sure, with the specific goal of making sure that diversity is increased. So
appreciate that. And then Rouhan, we'll have you add some additional commentary here.
Yes, and I think just very quickly, I think when we talk about what's so different about this context, and as we've seen so very vividly with the social justice movements that have been going on all around the country, technology is different. I mean, technology is there. And it's the ability and the advent to be able to utilize that in mass media and be able to have owned media be so, you know, prevalent in our everyday. And Joe mentioned in regards to TikTok, and you know, if he mentioned it in terms of the translators and what have you, technology and the utilization of that is at our fingertips. And so the ability of our organizations to utilize that as well, to be able to reprogram what we think of clinical trials. We've all seen the new Netflix show, maybe, or heard about the Netflix show that talks about social media and how social media.
Hey, Rouhan, now you're back on. Okay, keep going. You were talking about the social experiment. Yep.
Yes, so it's the social experiment, you know, utilizing that same tool to be able to convey to our audiences, specifically in minority communities, can have long-lasting effects, as it has with the social justice movement that we've seen. So I would say that technology is one thing that I think at its height right now is available to us and is current that is different.
Okay. So now let's hear about some of the things that have worked, right? We've been talking about some strategies, but it's different to have strategies that actually then go into action. And so would love to hear, Bryant, from you about some strategies turn action that are moving the needle. And then Marion, from you as well, from your seat, would love to hear about what you've seen work to help increase minority trial enrollment and that have been effective building up the trust that we need with that community.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'll point to there's actually encouraging thing is that there's no lack of organizations, I think, at this point that are making an effort or contributing to addressing this issue individually and collectively. I didn't mention it earlier, but there's actually a consortium across the industry, across data providers, across academia that is converging on the COVID-19 topic. If you go to, I think it's COVID-19 research database.org, you'll see the organizations that are represented. I think a few here today are there, where we are collectively in a non-compete, sharing data and looking at ways to, taking a data-driven approach to these problems, generating evidence and insights into, how patients or populations are being differentially affected by COVID. By COVID. There's a great organization called Lazarus that is, again, taking a data-driven approach at looking at something that was mentioned earlier, which is really fundamentally the readiness of patients to participate in a trial. Not simply putting the burden on them of, signing a consent and signing up for something in making it such an important decision in a dire situation, but really taking a strategic, methodological, tactical approach to understanding what predicts, what are the parameters that predict a successful patient, the situation, be it socially, be it financially, really taking a very structured approach there. I don't want to mention any of my clients, but fundamentally, collectively, I'm seeing a lot of organizations looking at data to benchmark where they are in comparison to others, taking different strategies to see what's successful in particular indications in terms of, looking at the indications that are disproportionately affecting our communities, and then looking at the sites and locations that where we are, looking at catchment information to see, as reported to the NIH, whether or not they have a chance to actually recruit the patients and basically, as said earlier, meet people where they are. And then the last one, I'll shout out Dr. Sandoval, who spoke at our conference last year. His wonderful program, Tu Salud, Tu Familia, actually won an Emmy this year for his work in educating the Latinx community on clinical trials. So I think, in summary, basically, we're taking a village approach, as represented on this panel. We have quite a few industries represented, and the solutions that we're seeing a collective effort, of course, not just from the pharma industry or even the FDA, who's doing a great job with the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. I have to shout them out as well, in terms of really taking a multi-pronged approach, because this is not a sort of a it's not a one-size-fits-all problem. So we're going to need a solution that's not one-size-fits-all as well.
Marion, would love to hear from you.
So yes, I think Bryant said it all, to be honest with you. He hit on all of the key points. And I think when you listen to what Courtney and what Jacquelyn described earlier, those are great examples of how we're getting it done at this moment. The other thing, going back to the last question that I think fits into this as well, is around what's different now. And I think it's sharing and listening, right? So when you look, what Brian was just saying, when you look at the Pharma Trade Association, you look at the FDA, people are not trying to do this by themselves anymore. They're saying, how do we all come together as a collective to get this done? So I think that's something that's very different because, you know, in the past, you know, you want to be the first one out there. So you kind of hold all your information. Everyone is sharing right now. So I think that's something that's very different and that's going to help us to propel and move forward quicker. Another thing I think is around being intentional and committed. You'll be surprised what you can get done just by being intentional about it and being committed. So, and I think the listening part as well as the sharing is also critically important. So I'll give you a great example. In our community, we make a lot of assumptions sometimes that other people understand our plight, that they've heard the stories about Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and all of those things over and over, but they haven't. And we can say, well, they should, but they haven't. So how open are we to educate? So we had a program on Juneteenth, and it was called Juneteenth, Generational Trauma and Mental Health in the African American Community. And we talked about the impact of slavery as well as Juneteenth on healthcare disparities today. You would have been shocked at how many Caucasian people were crying. I had no idea. So we have to make sure we're open to sharing as well as listening and then collaborating more broadly, not in silos. And I think those are the answers to the problem.
I think you're giving us some really good ideas and some really great feedback. So thank you both, Bryant and Marion. John, here's a question for you and also to you, Jacquelyn. As we think about moving the needle forward, what stakeholders need to be engaged and educated around this journey of the benefits of minorities being enrolled in clinical trials? And are there specific messages, maybe I should say that, by stakeholder that we need to also elevate?
Sure. You know, I wrote down what I think the major stakeholders are. The FDA, who's responsible for regulating these drugs that come to market, the sponsors, which are the drug companies, the Novartis and Pfizer's of the world. But a key point for people who may not be involved in how drugs come to market are the clinical research organizations, the CRO, and they're often responsible for selecting the sites and guiding the study. And I'll give a quick anecdote. We once did a study where it was a pediatric study, small study with 6 sites. And it turns out that the investigator meeting was held in Salt Lake City, Utah. And the reason they chose that is that they had 4 of their sites were in Utah. So we can imagine what the demographics of that study looked like. And I just remember that and remember going out of there. I love Utah, never had been there, never had a reason to go there and love the city. But I immediately thought to myself, I guess I'm gonna be responsible for all the minority enrollments in this study. And so I think we need to make sure we educate the CROs. And so I think those are some of the major stakeholders who are really the ones who determine the design of the study, the site selection, and ultimately for the FDA to say, look, if you want to bring these drugs to market, we need to see that it's been properly studied in the target population or the population who will ultimately be taking these medications. And I think if that message is conveyed, I think ultimately, eventually, they'll get through and then be, as we've said earlier, much more intentional about getting minorities enrolled in their studies.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Jacquelyn, let's hear some of your wisdom. Still on mute. Okay, Jacquelyn, we will come back to you. Okay, there you are. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. I think what we've learned in terms of stakeholders is that, you know, it's going to take, you know, all of us coming together, as John has said. We can, as sponsors, we can do everything in our power to bring forward new drugs and new medications, you know, but if, especially with this vaccine, if If people don't trust us, then they're not going to take it. So we have to do our best to include all the voices, the FDAs, the physicians, the community voices, the trusted voices, the grassroots organization, but we have to include the patients as well. And one of the things that we're starting to do, and we need to make sure when we're doing it, we get the diversity in the voice. But now when we're designing our protocols, we're getting input from the advocacy groups. We're getting input from actual patients that have participated in other studies. And so we just need to turn that up a little bit and make sure we're including diversity in the voice of the patient. We need to include, our churches. Everybody needs to be a part of this so that we can start to build the trust, so we can help people come along. It has to be a two-way dialogue. As someone said, we have to share, we have to listen, but we also have to all come along together. And another thing that someone mentioned that we need to do, and we are starting to look at this, is that we do need to make sure that we're training at all levels on cultural sensitivity, on the importance of clinical diversity, because as someone mentioned, everybody's not aware of our story. Everybody's not aware of what has been, unfortunately, all the abuses that have happened since slavery. So we need to be open, we need to talk more, and we need to include everybody around the table so that we can make sustainable differences, so that we can have equity and inclusion in our trials, and therefore, hopefully, reduce healthcare disparities in the long run, because that's what we're doing this for.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And then for our last formal question here, listen, everybody on this call is part of the Divine Nine family, which means you're all educated. We do have a lot of commas after each of our names, right? But what we want to do is make sure that our strategy is translating to the patients. So I really want to hear from Dr. Ron and from Ifoma. How do we take all of these big strategies, all of these 5-syllable words, and make them translatable and transferable to the people that we're trying to reach the most, which are ultimately our patients? So Ron, we'll start with you, and Ifoma will give you the closing remarks on that.
Well, I think it's well. I think that the comments today have been outstanding, and you really heard, I think, a very nice network of ideas. And were they to be coordinated, one can only imagine how a full community, I would imagine, could benefit. For me, I think one way to address it is to look, I think, at community stakeholders that very often, I think, may not be strictly in the educational or academic side, but have a tremendous amount of community support, be they our churches and our community organizations. I think pastors are very popular in the community that I come from in Houston, Texas, where if you really want to, get your message out, you want the large pastors or large churches to support it. Example I often give is I'm a psychiatrist by training, and many years ago, if you had a health fair, there'd be no depression screening next to the high blood pressure screening or things of that nature. And now I think that as pastors have actually come into the mode and appreciate that depression screening is as important as cholesterol screening and high blood pressure screening. You said it in all settings, and we actually pick up a lot more of these depression concerns, I think, in those type venues. So clearly, I think we have to kind of recognize which individuals and communities are likely to be heard and can actually move and get people to change their behavior. I think community stakeholders and community leaders, not only politicians or people who individuals believe in, and a lot of focus on the word trust today, I sort of support that. I think that that's how you coordinate, I think, a linked network of ideas, and you can get people to join. One of my final points, I think clinical research is, I think, very indicative of many other areas of life. You have to get people to move outside their comfort zone. I think I've heard a lot about that today. We got to find ways to get persons to do what's actually best for them individually, let alone best for, I think, overall community and our society, but it may take a bit of a push. I think this kind of support, accurate information, ways to alleviate and address fear are their successful strategies kind of moving forward. I really like what I've heard today. Many good ideas that I think we should implement.
Yeah, so, I hate the term herd immunity. I get it. I understand it's important. As a people that have been seen as animals, I think there's a different way that we can look at it. I like to think of it as village immunity. And the reason why I think village immunity is a little different than herd immunity is because as we start to embrace our equity footprint in society, I want to tail the question you asked about what has changed. And the reality is, what has changed is that what's driving America are not only our people, it's the individuals on the margins. It's the individuals who are the most poor. It's the individuals who are the most vulnerable. It's the individuals that, based off of whatever is on their certificate or whatever is in their bank account, wouldn't qualify them, if we're honest with ourselves, to even enter many of our offices. And yet we are seeing laws and policies that are changing at rapid rates that even legislation has not been able to do. And what is my point about that? I believe in the village. I believe that our stakeholders include the church leaders and the person on the corner who gives their own hood prophecy. I believe that there are individuals who actually are data scientists for Black lives, doctors for Black lives, data for Black lives, that should also be speaking with individuals on this call about what does it look like to have both the science and the community-centered, people-centered approaches dare to blend with each other, because at times, if we're honest with ourselves, they compete. There's a feeling of, whose voice is going to matter more at the table. So when I think of what our strategy should think of or should consist of, I'm thinking that even with this group, and I know we have a lot on our plate, but I am willing to see how we move forward, since we have a range of both social justice as well as expertise on a community awareness model that doesn't rush just to get us to trial. I know that that's the goal that we all want to get to, but the reality is we have some steps to get to, and trust is not something we should rush. We should figure out how we design messaging that talks about trusting those that have our best interests in these spaces, while also making sure that we are healthy and that the two are not mutually exclusive. That is a priority, and we need to make sure that the individuals we've identified that are credible messengers are a part of that strategy. Number two, I wasn't joking when I put in the comment, you have to pay us in equity. It is beyond time that those who have been on the streets, those who have been changing, whether it's in Florida, restoration rights, or in the Midwest where law enforcement is being redesigned, we need a movement in the medical space that's just as crucial as that. So what does it mean for us to invest in the individuals that are at the front lines, that already have the ears of individuals because they are trusted and they've proven to their communities that even in the midst of COVID, they are willing to fight for them? You all have the language. So how do we get that battery pack into the individuals that are already doing this information? And then how do we invest in them for the long term? Not just for the one-time canvassing, but what does it look like for them to then be a part of our formal institution of medicine? And that leads to my final point. I think we have to look at professionalizing equity and advocacy very differently. That there are individuals right now, as young as high school, all the way to individuals that may have been retired, that are crucial to how this work gets done. They can no longer just be consultants that come in once or twice when we need them. That still feels like being a guinea pig. We actually need to invest in how they are a part of our pharmacies, our institutions, and our communities, and look at how that could also be not just a pipeline for individuals to be in trials, but also an economic pipeline for individuals to be seen and respected in the medical community.
Amen. I think that was an excellent answer from both of our panelists here. I want to transition real quickly to just a couple of questions that we've been receiving from our audience. And the majority of them have been focused on Black investigators. So I want to pose this to the panel. If you have an answer, just raise your hand, signal that. But one question is, and I'm going to combine a couple of them. What's being done to increase the number of Black investigators? And is there some sort of database that we can reference or use that shows where some of these investigators currently sit? So anyone want to take? All right, Ron, we'll start with you.
Yeah, briefly, I think I mentioned earlier, I'm the chairman of the board of the NMA Foundation. We're called the Cobb Research Institute. And we have a 200-person network of Cobb scholars who are young biomedical scientists, investigators, typically MD and PhDs within 10 years of completing their terminal degree. The goal is to provide mentorship and networking for issues just like this, What if you're an African provider or a trainee and you were getting your PhD in Iowa, and there were no other individuals who are African American or who had a similar interest as you, or really just believe that thinking these issues in this moment, or we may pair you with someone who may be in Chicago or Miami or Los Angeles where I am right now. So I think programs like ours and others as well, I think are going to be essential for us to develop what I like to call the network, which I think strengthens the ideas, but also provides, I think, much of the career lifelong support that persons need to foster an academic career and perhaps engage in this type of work. I also want to add that we do look for the ways to partner with the industry to provide funding for these kind of approaches kind of going forward.
Ravyn,
yeah, Tracey, please go ahead.
Jump in there as well. Again, from the American Diabetes Association, this is critical, and so we have some minority fellowship awards that we're pushing. Do our part. We have some postdoctoral awards. We have some undergraduate internship, minority undergraduate internship awards, as well as junior faculty awards. We need to get more and more minorities in the field at large. Additionally, I'm on the board, advisory board for the NIDDK, again, where we are also trying to attack this issue of lack of diversity in the actual investigators. So again, lots of work to be done here, but we've got to make sure that there's funding to actually keep these researchers in the field.
Yep, excellent. And then maybe one last question, since we are running short on time here. I'm actually going to pose this, Rouhan, to you, and Courtney, you probably would have a nice perspective on this as well. How do academic institutions hold investigators to the commitments for the inclusion of diversity of patients in these clinical trials, with some kind of air quotes of they just won't join? So Rouhan, we'll start with you, and Courtney, we'll end with you.
I mean, the short answer is that, a lot of academic institutions could do better, I think, with holding investigators accountable to the inclusion of trials, especially because shortly afterwards, I mean, a lot of academic institutions have very much shifted from a thought process of they've shifted to a thought process of trying to be the best at all costs and rising up the rankings, and that has dominated if they could meet the certain criteria. And a lot of times having diverse and inclusive environments are not part of that criteria to rise up those rankings. And so I think that begs the question more so, how could they become a lot better? And a lot of academic institutions, one of the results that you're seeing from a lot of these social justice movements is they've started to, for instance, at USF, they sent out a team science program. And so that team science grant program has highlighted 25 grant projects that could lead to more team science to impact social justice when it comes to health disparities. And a lot of institutions have started to do certain things that are of the same stature, recognizing that that diversity is indeed valuable. And then also hiring. So in their hiring practices and things of that nature, putting more of an intention on diverse candidate hires. That's been something, whereas my other institution, Moffitt Cancer Center, they've started to become more intentional about hiring across the different sectors that affect our patient population. And that is basic and clinical and translational research, clinical providers, as well as population science, and those that are actually in the communities. So and a lot of organizations and institutions can stand to do more from that.
Yeah, so I agree with Rouhan that there needs to be some changes. I know as a physician scientist at NIH, we have to report what percentage of patients are of African descent, what percentage of patients are male versus female, but I'm actually not sure what happens with that information. And I think with this movement that eyes are being opened, and I really believe that there are going to be some positive changes for the better to really ensure that diversity improves in clinical trials.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. We're nearing the end of our time here, so I'm going to actually have our last question to our panelists. It's going to be a little different than maybe what I had initially thought we would do. And I just want to go around the horn and have everyone leave one word. Think of one word as your key takeaway for today's conversation. One word for today's conversation. And again, we'll go in the founding order. So Ron, we'll start with you. What is one word you want to leave with our audience today?
Trust.
I love it. All right. Jacquelyn, we're coming over to you. What's your one word?
Engagement.
Love it. All right. Marion, we're coming to you next. What is your one word?
Partnership.
Partnership. Love it. Bryant, what is your one word?
Of course, the nuke would steal my word. Intention.
Intention. We've heard that a lot. Love that. Joe, what is your one word?
Compensation.
Compensation. Love it. Courtney, what is your one word?
Inclusivity.
Inclusivity. Love it. John, what is your one word?
Diversity.
Diversity. Love it. Okay, where are we? Effie, what is your one word?
Equity.
Equity. Thank you. Thank you. Tracey, what is your one word?
Connection.
Connected? All right. Rouhan, what is your one word?
Community.
Community. And my one word for today's panel is possibility. I want to thank everyone for joining us in this engaging town hall today. If I could have all of my D9 brothers and sisters throw it up, just so everyone can see once again who you're representing. Thank you all so much for attending today's call. We hope that you got some very tangible and some very real tactics and strategies that you can take from today's call. We also want to remind you that there are still 2 more days of the National Minority Equality Forum that are taking place, and tomorrow's town hall is actually going to be focused on COVID and the 2020 election. You will not want to miss it. So thank you all again for your time, for sharing your evening with us, and we will talk to you soon. Let's go make the world better based on what we heard today. Thank you all very much.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
I'm Bill Bailey, I'm here. He did. That's what to do it. Well, I've not seen him face to face. I literally just finished.
Nina, are we done? Not sure she's still on.